The millionaire hadn't heard his son's voice for years. People thought he was mute until the millionaire hired a new babysitter. When he comes home early from work, he sees the babysitter talking with the little boy. The babysitter had discovered why he never opened up. The millionaire was shocked upon learning the reason. The chilly November morning swallowed Manhattan in a grey haze, turning the skyscrapers of the Upper East Side into specters of glass and steel. Inside a penthouse on the 30th floor, the silence was as absolute as the panoramic view of Central Park. Henry, a man whose posture seemed tailored for expensive suits and million-dollar decisions, adjusted the knot of his silk tie, the sound of the fabric a rough scratch in the void. His eyes, accustomed to scanning stock market charts and identifying hesitation in business partners, now measured the woman standing before him. Helena had a serene gaze and hands that rested on the strap of a simple, worn leather bag. She didn't seem intimidated by the oppressive luxury of the room, nor by the man whose net worth was discussed in business columns. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the polished marble. "Leo's routine is precise," he began, his voice an instrument of control. "Meals at 7, 11s and 6. Physical therapy twice a day. The medications are listed with schedules that permit no delay. He doesn't speak. Don't expect answers." With every word, he built a wall, a fortress to protect what was left of his fractured world. He led her to the living room, where a pale, 10-year-old boy with immense eyes sat in his wheelchair, facing the glass wall that displayed the city like an unattainable prize. The boy, Leo, didn't turn. His body was still, but his shoulders carried a tension that was painful just to look at. Henry continued with the instructions, detailing the operation of the equipment, the emergency contacts, the prohibitions. It was an operations manual, not an introduction to a son. He watched her from the corner of his eye, waiting for a retreat, an inappropriate question. A sign that she would be like the others, efficient but distant, fulfilling a contract. Helena, however, just listened. When he finished, she didn't address him. She walked slowly to the wheelchair, the soft sound of her shoes, a contrast to the ticking of a priceless clock on the sleek, modern fireplace. She didn't touch Leo. She simply rested her hands on the leather of the chair's back and, with a delicacy that disarmed the sterile atmosphere, knelt until her eyes were level with his. The boy met her gaze in the reflection of the glass. It was then that she spoke, her voice a whisper that seemed to fill all the cracks in that place. "I can hear you without words." Henry felt an inexplicable chill. The sentence was absurd, an invasion. He feigned indifference, checked the time on his white gold watch, and announced he had to leave for a meeting about a new investment. As he walked toward the door, his heart, shielded for years by the pressure of business and the shadow of an old loss, beat in a strange, disobedient rhythm. Helena's words reverberated in his mind like a stubborn bell, a melody he could neither decipher nor silence. Even as the solid wood door closed behind him, leaving him on the outside of his own home, Henry's day dragged on in a succession of meetings and phone calls that, for the first time in years, felt devoid of urgency. Sitting in his Italian leather chair, with the city at his feet, he found himself staring at the stock market charts without truly seeing them. The numbers that dictated the flow of his vast capital, the highs and lows that could mean millions in profit or loss, were just colorful blurs on the screen today. Helena's phrase echoed in his mind, a soft, unsettling counterpoint to the cacophony of Wall Street. "I can hear you without words." What kind of woman said something like that? It wasn't professional, it wasn't objective, it was human. And that scared him more than any market fluctuation. He, a man who had built a fortune on cold logic, who measured success in profitability and assets, felt invaded by something he couldn't quantify. A restlessness gnawed at him, a strange feeling that the most important place was not there, in that tower of power, but in the silence of his own apartment, Around 6 in the evening, a time when he would normally be immersed in investment reports, he did something unthinkable. He stood up, grabbed his jacket, and went home. He didn't tell anyone. The need to see, to understand what was happening, was stronger than any commitment. When he opened the door, the first thing that hit him was not the usual icy silence. It was a smell, a warm, welcoming aroma of freshly baked cinnamon rolls and chamomile tea. The air conditioning, which he kept at a polar temperature, was off. The late afternoon light streamed softly through the windows, painting the room in shades of orange and gold. For a moment, Henry felt like a stranger in his own home. He tiptoed down the marble hallway, following the low sound of stifled crying. In the living room, the scene he found paralyzed him. Helena was kneeling on the rug, in front of Leo. The boy was crying convulsively, his small body shaken by sobs that seemed to come from a very deep place. But it wasn't a cry of pain or a tantrum. Henry, who had become an expert in deciphering his son's silences, recognized something new in those tears. It was relief. Leo's eyes, fixed on Helena's, communicated more than any speech. And then, the impossible happened. Amid the sobs, a hoarse voice, fragile from disuse, cut through the air. A whisper Henry hadn't heard in years. "They hurt me at school." The floor seemed to disappear from under the millionaire's feet. The world of business, of stocks, of dollars and all his wealth crumbled to dust. Leo's silence wasn't a condition, not a neurological disorder that the country's best doctors couldn't diagnose. It was a blockage, a wall built brick by daily humiliations, far from his sight. The caregiver, with her simple methods and genuine attention, had achieved in a few hours what he, with all his money and power, had never even suspected. In that moment, Henry understood that the greatest liability in his life wasn't on his balance sheets, but there, in his son's wounded heart. Henry remained motionless, the door still ajar behind him, a portal to the world of certainties he had just abandoned. The sound of Leo's words, however fragile, had demolished the structure of his life. He watched Helena, who was now gently embracing the boy's shoulders, rocking him in a soft rhythm until the sobs began to subside. She didn't look at Henry. All her attention was focused on Leo, creating a bubble of safety amidst the cold luxury of the room. When the crying finally turned into tired breathing, she helped him dry his face with the sleeve of her own sweater. Only then did her eyes meet his. And there was no triumph or accusation in them, only a quiet compassion that completely disarmed him. He closed the door slowly and approached, feeling awkward in his own home. "How?" was all he managed to ask, his voice lower than he intended. Helena gestured to the sofa, and he sat down, his impeccable suit suddenly uncomfortable. She knelt beside the coffee table and opened her simple bag. From inside, she took out the objects that had worked the miracle. First, a blue-covered notebook, its pages visibly worn. Then, a glass jar filled with seashells. Finally, she placed her phone on the table, open to a playlist of children's folk songs. "He didn't need to talk," she explained, her voice gentle. "He needed to be understood. We started with this." She opened the notebook. The first pages contained simple drawings: a sun, a house, a plate of food. Next to each, a gesture was sketched out. "I learned this at a community workshop, associating sounds and ideas with movements, a choreography of courage." She flipped through a few more pages, and the drawings became more complex, darker. Children pointing, exaggerated laughter, and finally, a large red X over the mouth of a stick figure in a wheelchair. Henry felt the air leave his lungs. His entire empire, his fortune built to crush obstacles, seemed useless and impotent before that notebook. He, a man who dealt in multi-million-dollar deals, hadn't been able to see the suffering drawn in silence. "The seashells," Helena continued, picking one up and placing it to Leo's ear, "have the sound of the ocean, a sound that doesn't judge, that only comforts. The boy closed his eyes, his expression softening. Henry's impulse was immediate, visceral. He grabbed his phone, the businessman's instinct taking over. "I'm calling the school. I'll sue them. I'll use every cent of my money to make sure they pay for this." This was how he solved problems, with force, with capital, with the certainty that everything and everyone had a price. But Helena placed her hand on his, a light but firm touch. "No," she said, "if you do that, the first thing they'll do is deny it. And Leo will shut down again, maybe forever. He'll feel his voice wasn't strong enough. We need proof, Henry. We need to prepare him." His name, spoken by her in that way, sounded less like a billionaire's and more like a father's. He stared at her, a battle raging inside him. The cold logic of business versus the emotional wisdom of this woman. For the first time, he yielded to something he couldn't control. He put his phone away. "What do we do then?" Helena took a deep breath. "First, we schedule a meeting. No accusations. Just a conversation about his well-being." Henry nodded, reluctantly. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of the headmistress of the elite school, a woman with whom he only exchanged pleasantries at charity events. When she answered, her voice polished and distant, he explained that he wanted to discuss Leo's development. The response came like a blade of ice. "Mr. Cole, of course, but I should mention that our reports indicate Leo is a withdrawn boy. I believe any difficulty adapting stems from his particular condition, not our exemplary environment." The veiled denial, the blame subtly shifted back to the boy, made Henry's blood boil. He hung up the phone and looked at Helena, his face a mask of contained fury. The war was just beginning. The morning of the meeting dawned with a pale sun that couldn't pierce the seriousness that had settled over the apartment. Henry put on his best suit, an armor of Italian fabric he wore to close major deals, feeling, paradoxically, more vulnerable than ever. Every dollar of his net worth seemed useless for the battle ahead. He watched Helena, who prepared Leo with a calm that both irritated and anchored him. She didn't talk about the meeting. Instead, she gently combed the boy's hair and helped him choose a shirt, turning the mundane act into a ritual of empowerment. She placed the blue-covered notebook in Leo's backpack, without fanfare, like someone tucking away a lucky charm. "This is for when you want to draw what you feel," she told the boy, and their eyes met with a complicity that Henry envied. The drive to the school was tense. The school was a fortress of exposed brick and impeccably manicured lawns, a symbol of status and exclusivity for which Henry paid a fortune. As they entered the headmistress's office, they were greeted by Monica, a woman with a rehearsed smile and a calculating gaze. Her office was a shrine to minimalism and power, with framed diplomas and a glass desk so clean it seemed untouchable. "Mr. Cole, what a pleasure," she said, her voice polished, ignoring Helena for a moment before adding with a condescending nod, "and the companion." The meeting began like a chess game. Henry, following Helena's advice, tried to be diplomatic. He spoke about Leo's sudden progress, about the words that were beginning to emerge, and about his concern with the school environment. Monica listened with studied patience, her fingers steepled on the desk. When he finished, she opened a folder. "Our records are impeccable," she stated, sliding some papers across the glass. "We have reports from our educational psychologists. Leo is an introspective boy. His condition, naturally, makes him a target for childish curiosity. But bullying, we would never tolerate such behavior in our institution." With every word, she dismissed his concern, twisting it into the overprotection of a wealthy father. It was then that she made her tactical error. She turned to Leo, who was huddled in his wheelchair, and said with artificial sweetness, "Leo, dear, why don't you tell us? Did one of your little friends upset you? Victor, perhaps? He's such a popular boy." Upon hearing the name Victor, A visible wave of panic shot through Leo's body. He trembled, his eyes wide with terror, and brought his hands to his face, recoiling as if he'd been struck. The reaction was so visceral, so undeniable, that for a second Monica's smile faltered, but she recomposed herself instantly. "You see," she said, her tone now tinged with false compassion. "The boy is extremely sensitive. A simple mention of a classmate destabilizes him. Perhaps the issue isn't with the school, but with how he processes the world around him." She had turned the tables. The proof of trauma had become, in her narrative, proof of Leo's instability. Henry tasted the bitter tang of defeat. He was cornered. The meeting ended shortly after, with vague promises of closer observation. The ride home was steeped in a heavy, dense silence. Helena stared out the window, her face tight with sadness. Henry gripped the steering wheel, anger at his own powerlessness simmering within him. He had lost. They reached the building's garage, and the sound of the engine shutting off amplified the emptiness. He was preparing to say something, anything, when a small but surprisingly firm voice came from the back seat. "Enough!" The word, a single, powerful syllable, hung in the air, stronger than any argument, more valuable than any stock on the market. It was Leo's voice, and it carried the unmistakable sound of a beginning. The word "enough" still echoed in the garage as they entered the private elevator. It was the first time Leo had used his voice to set a boundary, and the impact on Henry was seismic. A crack opened in his armor, revealing a father who had long forgotten how to act. Upon reaching the penthouse, his primary impulse was to retake control, to protect. "That's it. We're pulling him out of there right now," he declared, grabbing his phone again, his brain already calculating logistics, costs, the capital required to move heaven and earth. "I'll find the best school in Europe if I have to. They have inclusion programs, the best specialists. I can buy a house there. Money isn't the problem." He spoke quickly, tumbling over his words, his desperation disguised as efficiency. It was his modus operandi, turn pain into an action plan, an investment project with a guaranteed return. Helena, who was gently pushing Leo's wheelchair toward the glass-enclosed balcony, stopped and turned to him. Her eyes held no judgment, but a profound wisdom that made him fall silent. "Running away won't erase what happened," she said, her voice calm but incisive. "It will only teach him that when things get hard, the solution is to disappear." He said enough because he found a strength, Henry. Our job is to help him use that strength, not abandon it. The argument hit him like a punch. He, the master of business strategy, hadn't considered the message his actions would send to his son. His wealth had accustomed him to bypassing problems, to buying solutions, not to facing them head-on. The internal conflict was brutal, the instinct to protect versus the need to empower. This dilemma couldn't be solved with dividends or compound interest. In the days that followed, a new, fragile and delicate routine began to form. Helena, sensing Leo's retreat after the confrontation at the school, searched the apartment for clues. At the back of the boy's closet, hidden behind a pile of untouched board games, she found them. A thin folder held a collection of drawings, hastily done on crumpled notebook paper. They were scenes of silent cruelty, stick figures in wheelchairs being pushed off a basketball court, empty speech bubbles pointed at them, and the most devastating image of all, a self-portrait of Leo with a large red X over his mouth. Helena's heart ached. She photographed each drawing with her phone, the screen illuminating the pain those images contained. That night, after Leo had fallen asleep to the sound of the seashells, she showed the photos to Henry. He stared at the images, his face paling. The ruthless executive gave way to a devastated father. The evidence was there, irrefutable, drawn by his own son's hand. "You were right," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "We can't run." Their plan began to take shape, no longer based on impulse, but on a careful strategy. speech therapy focused on trauma, inclusion groups outside the school environment, and most importantly, giving Leo the tools to tell his own story. Helena suggested something that, at first, seemed strange to Henry: an inclusive drum circle she knew of in a public park not far from her own neighborhood. The music, the rhythm, the beat of the djembe vibrates in your chest, she explained. It's a way of expressing yourself with your whole body, not just your voice. Henry, who had always frequented exclusive clubs and sterile environments, hesitated. A public park, but Helena's determined gaze convinced him. To be present for that first meeting in the park, he had to cancel a crucial dinner with foreign investors, a decision that, according to his advisor, could cost him a multi-million-dollar contract. For the first time, the choice wasn't difficult. Seeing his son, hesitant at first, then tapping his hands to the rhythm of the drums, a tiny smile forming on his lips, Henry knew he was investing in something infinitely more valuable: the reconstruction of Leo's soul. That day's profit wouldn't be measured in euros or dollars, but in the almost inaudible sound of one palm against another. The city was beginning to shed the damp grey of November, and a shy sun cast golden shafts of light over Central Park. On a Sunday morning, Henry, Helena, and Leo were strolling along one of the less crowded paths. Henry, for the first time in years, wasn't wearing a suit. He was in jeans and a polo shirt, feeling like an actor in an unfamiliar role. The forced proximity with Helena created a subtle tension between them, an electricity they both pretended not to notice. It was in the small things that their connection deepened, in the way she adjusted the blanket on Leo's legs, in the way he went ahead to buy her a coffee without her asking. That morning, a small miracle occurred. While they were watching the ducks on the lake, a gentle breeze blew, and Leo, who until then had only observed the world, turned his face to the wind, closed his eyes, and smiled. A genuine, open smile that lit up his pale features. Henry felt a lump in his throat. How long had it been since he'd seen his son smile like that? The moment of peace, however, was broken by an unexpected presence. "Henry, darling, what a wonderful coincidence." The voice, laden with expensive perfume and an unwelcome familiarity, belonged to Patricia, his ex-partner, an elegant woman with a knack for turning any situation into a stage for herself. She approached, her gaze flicking from Henry to Helena with a quick, dismissive calculation before settling on Leo with performative pity. "And how is our big boy? I heard you hired a nanny. How wonderful that you're trying to give him a normal life." The word nanny was delivered with an intonation that turned it into an insult. Henry felt his anger rise, but before he could respond, Patricia had already pulled out her phone. "Smile, a picture to remember this sweet moment." The camera's click was swift, treacherous. She departed just as quickly, leaving a trail of discomfort in her wake. Henry dismissed the episode, considering it just another of Patricia's eccentricities. What he didn't know was that, later that day, the photo, carefully cropped to show only him and Helena laughing at something Leo had said, would begin circulating in the school's parent group chats. The caption, planted by Patricia, was venomous and insinuating. "Looks like the mighty Henry Cole has found a new investment." And the son, just an excuse for the secret romance. The gossip spread like a virus. By the next day, the story had become ammunition for Headmistress Monica. The bullying complaint, which had been merely a nuisance, was now recontextualized as a conspiracy. The caregiver, according to the new narrative, was manipulating the boy and his father for her own gain, perhaps seeking a hefty inheritance or an advantageous marriage. Helena began to feel the effects immediately. Mothers who used to greet her with a nod now averted their eyes. A father, a member of the school board and one of Henry's business associates, called him, "Henry, what's this all about? You're mixing feelings with fatherly decisions. This is terrible for business." If this scandal grows, forget about that investment fund we were putting together. No one wants their capital tied to family drama. The pressure was immense, coming from all sides. Henry's reputation, the cornerstone of his empire, was under threat. And Helena, the woman who had brought back Leo's voice, was now the epicenter of the earthquake. Feeling the weight of the situation and afraid of further harming the man for whom she felt something she didn't dare name, she made a painful decision. On Wednesday, she didn't show up. She only sent a short text to Henry. "I need to step away for a few days. It's better for Leo." Silence once again reigned in the 30th floor penthouse, but this time it was different. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a silence of absence. The smell of cinnamon rolls had vanished, the children's songs no longer played, and Leo, sensing the abandonment, retreated back into his mute world. The apartment, which had started to feel like a home, withered again, becoming just a collection of expensive assets, cold and lifeless. The silence that settled over the apartment was heavier than before. It was a silence haunted by the recent memory of laughter and the scent of chamomile tea. Henry paced from room to room, the phone glued to his ear, trying to manage his financial empire while his small domestic world crumbled. He watched Leo, huddled in his wheelchair, his eyes once again fixed on the glass window, the muteness returning like a frost that freezes everything. The blue-covered notebook lay closed on the table, untouched. Helena's absence was a vacuum that not even all his fortune could fill. Every passing hour was a reminder of his powerlessness. He, the man who moved millions with a single order, couldn't convince one woman to stay, couldn't draw a single word from his own son. Rage consumed him. Rage at Patricia, at the headmistress, at the world, but mostly at himself for allowing the situation to reach this point. On Friday afternoon, the final blow came in the form of an official email from the school. It summoned him to an extraordinary meeting the following Monday. The tone was formal, almost legalistic. It was clear this wasn't an invitation for dialogue, but for an ambush. Monica was preparing to close the matter, using the gossip as a weapon to protect the institution's reputation and, in the process, crush his credibility. And Helena's panic, a feeling Henry rarely allowed himself, began to seep in. He looked at his son, so fragile, and realized he couldn't face this alone. His business strategies, his veiled threats, his financial power, they were all useless here. Swallowing the pride that was the backbone of his identity, he picked up the phone and called Helena. She answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant. He didn't ask, he begged. "I need you," he said, the words coming out with difficulty. "Not as an employee, as a partner. Leo needs you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, her internal struggle. "I'll be there Monday morning," she finally replied. On Monday, when the doorbell rang, it was as if the apartment could breathe again. Helena entered, her eyes weary but determined. Leo, upon seeing her, didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders visibly eased. While Henry prepared for war, adjusting his tie like a soldier tightening his helmet strap, Helena approached Leo. She didn't bring a master plan or a rehearsed speech. She simply picked up the blue-covered notebook from the table. "Do you want to bring this?" she asked softly. "Your voice is in here too." The boy nodded, clutching the notebook to his chest like a shield. At the school, the meeting room was set up like a tribunal. Monica was there, flanked by the school's lawyer and 2 board members. It was a spectacle of appearances, designed to intimidate and annihilate. Leo trembled as he entered, the atmosphere thick with hostility. The headmistress began her speech, talking about destabilizing external influences and the need to protect the school community from personal agendas. The insinuation was clear. Henry was about to explode, his rage overpowering his strategy, when a low sound drew everyone's attention. Leo, with trembling hands, had placed the blue notebook on the glass table. He opened it to a specific page, the one with the drawing of the basketball court, with the stick figure in the wheelchair being excluded. With a pen Helena handed him, he wrote, in a shaky, childish hand, the name Victor above one of the aggressors. Then he raised his head, his eyes, large and filled with a pain that was finally overflowing, met his father's, and with a voice that was no longer a whisper but a declaration, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, he said, "I need to be heard." The silence that followed was sharp, absolute. The narrative Monica had so carefully constructed had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The silence in the meeting room was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Leo's words, simple and direct, hung in the air, disarming everyone. The look of self-satisfaction on Monica's face dissolved, replaced by a poorly concealed panic. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to try and spin the situation, to frame it as yet another sign of the boy's excessive sensitivity. But she was interrupted. A woman sitting in the corner, a mother who had remained silent until then, stood up. Her eyes were fixed on Leo's notebook. "My son," she began, her voice trembling. "My son mentioned some teasing during recess. He said that Victor and his friends liked to make fun of anyone who was different. I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just kids being kids." The confession opened a floodgate. Another parent, one of the board members who had come to support the headmistress, cleared his throat, his face suddenly serious. "My daughter asked me the other day why Leo never played with anyone. She said he was always alone, watching from a distance." Monica's narrative was crumbling, brick by brick. The blame she had so skillfully tried to place on Leo and Helena was now ricocheting back onto the institution. Pressured, cornered, she stammered promises of internal measures, psychological support, and a full investigation. But behind the scenes, Henry knew the damage control machine was already in motion. On the way home, the atmosphere in the car was completely different. There was no defeat, but a fragile sense of victory. Henry looked at his son in the rearview mirror and saw, for the first time, not a victim, but a warrior. Leo held his blue notebook like a trophy. Back at the penthouse, Henry's phone began to ring incessantly. It was his publicist, a pragmatic man whose loyalty was to image, not truth. "Henry, this is a disaster," he said. His voice rushed. "The story is starting to leak. One of the parents at the meeting is a journalist. If this blows up in the media, your investors will pull back. A PR crisis tied to your holding company's name could tank your stock value. We need to release a statement, say it was all a misunderstanding, that the school is already taking action. We need to kill this, now." Henry felt the old instinct take over, the fear of financial loss, the need to protect his assets. He glanced at Helena, who was silently unpacking the few belongings she had brought. She was watching him, her gaze clear but filled with a silent question. He knew what she was thinking. Would he sacrifice her to protect his business? Would he downplay his son's pain to appease the market? The choice was clear, but the decision was the hardest of his life. He hesitated. That hesitation was all Helena needed to see. The old wound, the belief that she would always be the first to be discarded, reopened. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the door. "Helena, wait!" he called out. She stopped, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "You have your empire to protect, Henry, and I have my dignity. I can't stay and watch you turn your son's courage into a footnote to calm investors." The door closed softly, but to Henry, the sound was an explosion. He was alone again, in the middle of a penthouse worth a fortune, but which, in that moment, felt like the poorest place on earth. The victory from hours ago now tasted like ash. Helena's departure left an echo that no stock market transaction could silence. Henry felt as if he were steering a ship through a storm, with a navigation chart written in a language he didn't understand. He tried to fill the void with what he knew best: work. He dove into cash flow spreadsheets, analyzed the profitability of new funds, and gave curt orders to his subordinates. But it was useless. The image of Helena's disappointed gaze and Leo's accusatory silence haunted him, rendering every profit, every dividend, completely irrelevant. Leo, in turn, felt her absence like a physical blow. The courage he had shown at the school seemed to have evaporated, leaving him fragile and exposed. He would spend hours on the balcony, holding one of the seashells Helena had given him, trying to hear the ocean amidst the incessant noise of New York City. The tension in the apartment was almost unbearable, a mixture of unspoken regret and palpable sadness. Henry, desperate to reconnect with his son, tried everything. He bought the latest video games, expensive toys, books, but the gifts piled up in corners, untouched, monuments to his inability to understand what truly mattered. The real crisis erupted on a Wednesday night. Leo was quieter than usual, even refusing his favorite food. Henry was on the phone in a tense call with a European investor when he heard a sharp gasp from his son's room. He ended the call abruptly and rushed in. Leo was having a panic attack. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on a tablet screen. Henry grabbed the device, and what he saw made his blood run cold. An anonymous message sent through a social media app showed only a wheelchair emoji followed by a zipped mouth emoji and the word "shh." It was a cowardly, digital threat. But for Leo, it was confirmation of his worst fears. His voice was not welcome. His attempt to defend himself had only resulted in more intimidation. Seeing his son in that state of absolute terror was the final straw for Henry. The armor he had built over decades of ruthless business finally shattered. He hugged Leo, rocking him awkwardly, his heart pounding with a mixture of fury and despair. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just a father, terrified and lost. The publicist called again, insisting on the damage control strategy, but something inside Henry had changed. The politics of the market, the concern for assets and liabilities, all of it seemed absurdly small in the face of his son's real, tangible pain. On Saturday, seeking a refuge, a breath of fresh air from the suffocating apartment, Henry made an impulsive decision. He remembered Helena mentioning her neighborhood, a simple place of brownstones and community life. He put Leo in the car and drove without a specific destination, guided only by the vague memory of a conversation. A sound drew him in, a powerful, pulsating beat that seemed to come from the heart of the neighborhood. It was a street drumming troupe, practicing in a small park, their rhythms echoing off the buildings. The sound of the bass drums was powerful, a vibration you could feel in your chest. He parked the car and watched from a distance. Leo, who had been listless in the passenger seat, lifted his head. The beat of the drums seemed to envelop him, a sonic embrace. The drummers chanted a simple refrain, a deep do that invited participation. And then Leo, his voice still weak but audible, joined in. "Oh," Henry looked at him, stunned. There, in the middle of the street, to the sound of a drumming troupe, his son was singing. In that instant, clarity hit him with the force of a revelation. No contract, no stock, no amount of dollars or gold was worth more than the courage Leo was rediscovering. The battle wasn't about protecting a portfolio, it was about protecting a soul. And he knew, with a certainty he hadn't felt in years, what he had to do. The vibration of the drums still resonated in Henry as he drove home. That moment with the street drumming troupe had been a catalyst, a turning point that irrevocably realigned his priorities. The confusion and hesitation gave way to a clarity of purpose he hadn't felt since the early days of building his fortune. The fear of financial loss, which had dictated his actions for so long, now seemed a distant, insignificant ghost. The next morning, He summoned his publicist to the penthouse. The man arrived with a briefcase full of crisis mitigation strategies and pre-approved press releases. Henry didn't even let him sit down. "It's over," he said, his voice firm. "We're not killing this story." "On the contrary." The publicist stared at him, bewildered. "Henry, don't be rash. Think of your net worth, the stock market's reaction." "I have," Henry cut in. "And I've decided my greatest asset is my son." He then outlined his plan, not as a defense, but as an attack. First, he would draft an official statement, not for the business press, but for the community of parents and educators, announcing Leo's immediate withdrawal from the school. Second, he would use his capital not to hide the problem, but to expose it. He would announce the creation of a foundation, a substantial investment to sponsor inclusive arts and sports programs for children with disabilities in New York City. The first project, he would make sure to emphasize, would be to support the Drum Circle and other community arts groups that had made his son sing. The publicist turned pale. "That's corporate suicide. You're exposing yourself, declaring war on the very elite you're a part of. Your partners will see you as unstable, emotional. They'll pull investments. Boycott your businesses?" "Let them," Henry replied with an icy calm. "Anyone who builds an empire on silence and complicity is not a partner I want to have." The publicist, seeing his career built on spin and image control about to crumble along with Henry's old persona, tried one last appeal. "Think of your legacy, Henry. You'll be remembered as the man who mixed family and business and lost everything." "On the contrary," Henry said, walking to the door and opening it. "I'll be remembered as a father. You're fired." Alone, Henry felt a wave of freedom, as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time, he was using his wealth not as a shield, but as a tool for change. He sat down to write the statement, the words flowing with an honesty he hadn't practiced in years. Meanwhile, news of his intentions began to ripple through the subterranean channels of power. Patricia, learning that her stage for drama was being dismantled, was furious. She tried to call Henry, but he didn't answer. Her weapon, gossip, was useless against the truth spoken aloud. Headmistress Monica, informed by a board member of Henry's plan, felt the ground give way beneath her. The school, which prided itself on its exclusivity and impeccable reputation, was about to become the symbol of everything wrong with the system. The battle she thought she had won was just beginning, and she no longer controlled the narrative. Henry sent the statement late that afternoon. There was no immediate explosion, just the silence that precedes a storm. He sat on the balcony with Leo and watched the sunset paint the city. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether it would be the ruin of his financial empire or the beginning of something new. But as he looked at his son, who was drawing a set of drums in his blue notebook, he knew with absolute certainty, that he had made the right investment. The days following Henry's statement were strangely quiet. The business world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. A few longtime partners called, their voices a mix of concern and warning. Speaking of the importance of discretion and common sense, he listened to them all with a distant politeness, but did not waver in his decision. He knew that behind the scenes, his capital was being re-evaluated, his sanity questioned, and deals once considered certain were now on shaky ground. But the peace he felt in doing the right thing was more profitable than any financial investment. Realizing that the armor of power and control he had worn his whole life was, in fact, a prisoner, he made another radical decision. He scheduled an appointment with a therapist, sitting on a comfortable sofa in a room with soft light and the smell of old books. He felt more exposed than in any boardroom meeting. For the first time, he spoke openly about the loss of his wife years ago and how he had plunged into work to avoid dealing with the grief and the responsibility of raising a son alone. "I confused protection with control," he admitted, his voice hoarse. I thought if I could give Leo the best house, the best school, the best doctors, I would be doing my part. Work became my hiding place, a place where emotions could be translated into numbers and charts. It was easier to manage a fortune than a little boy's feelings. Meanwhile, Helena was fighting her own internal battles. She had moved back into her small, cozy brownstone, but the glass-walled penthouse in Manhattan still occupied her thoughts. The news of Henry's actions reached her through a friend who showed her the online statement. She read his words, feeling a surge of pride and surprise. He hadn't backed down, he had charged forward. This forced her to face her own truth. The tendency to sacrifice herself, to always put the needs of others before her own, was a pattern that had followed her since childhood, when she had to defend her younger siblings. She believed she only deserved love if she was indispensable, faultless. By leaving Henry and Leo, she wasn't just protecting herself, she was repeating a cycle. She decided that if she went back, it wouldn't just be for them, it would be for herself, for the belief that she deserved a place in that family, not as a savior, but as an equal. The final revelation, the missing link that connected all the pieces, came in an unexpected way. One evening, Helena was organizing a box of belongings she had left at Henry's apartment and found one of Leo's first drawings, made in the days when their communication was purely gestural. It was a simple drawing of a tall man in a suit next to a small boy. Below the figure, with Helena's help, Leo had practiced his first written word, a word they practiced in secret, to the sound of the seashells to muffle his hesitant voice, so it would be a surprise. The word was Dad. She remembered his difficulty in forming the sound, the frustration, and the joy when he finally succeeded. That same night, on the penthouse terrace, with the lights of Manhattan twinkling below like scattered treasure, Leo called out to Henry. He said nothing for a moment, just reached out and placed his hand on his father's. Then, in a clear, firm voice that held no trace of fear, he said, "Dad, thank you for listening to me." Henry's world, which had already been turned upside down, now settled on a new axis. The armor of years of self-sufficiency and repressed pain crumbled to dust. He looked at his son, his eyes burning with unshed tears, and he apologized, not just for not having listened before, but for having been absent in his own home. He didn't offer financial security, didn't promise to solve all problems with his assets. He offered presence, and with a humility he never knew he possessed. He asked, "You and me, can we learn how to do this together?" The conversation on the terrace was the foundation upon which Henry began to rebuild his life. The decision to make himself vulnerable, both in therapy and with his own son, created space for a genuine transformation. He knew, however, that one essential piece was missing. The next morning, he drove to Helena's neighborhood. He didn't call ahead, afraid she would refuse the visit. He parked his car in front of the simple brownstone, with a small garden of potted ferns by the entrance, a world away from his glass penthouse. For a moment, he hesitated. What if she rejected him? The possibility of loss, now that he understood the true value of human connection, was terrifying. He took a deep breath and rang the bell. Helena opened the door, the surprise on her face quickly replaced by a cautious expression. She didn't invite him in. She just stood there, on the threshold, waiting. "I didn't come to offer you a job," he began, the words coming out with a disarmed sincerity. "I came to ask for a partnership, and, if you'll let me, a future." He told her about therapy, about the conversation with Leo, about firing his publicist, not as a list of accomplishments, but as a confession of his failings and his new beginnings. "I've spent my whole life building an empire, accumulating assets, thinking about inheritance," he said, "but I've realized that the only legacy that matters is what we build in people's hearts. And you taught me that. You showed me that the greatest wealth isn't in investment funds, but in the courage to listen and to let yourself be heard." Helena listened, her heart pounding. She saw in his eyes not the controlling billionaire, but a man fighting to find a new path. His vulnerability mirrored her own. "I had to step away to find myself too, Henry," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I always thought I had to be the savior to be loved. I'm learning that I deserve to be cared for, too." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "So," he said, holding out his hand, not as a boss, but as an equal, "let's take care of each other, and together take care of our boy." The moment of greatest tension was not an explosion, but a silence charged with possibility. The choice they made there would define not only their future, but Leo's. And finally, Helena placed her hand in his. The touch was a contract signed not with ink, but with trust. In the following days, life found a new rhythm, a new harmony. Henry's foundation was officially launched, causing an uproar in the business community, but also inspiring others to reevaluate their priorities. The first concrete action was enrolling Leo in a new school. It wasn't an elite institution, but a public charter school known for its inclusion program and its active community. On the first day, Henry and Helena took him together. When they arrived, they were greeted not with cold formalities, but with a fall festival. Colorful banners decorated the schoolyard. The smell of cinnamon and apple cider donuts filled the air. And a class of children was enthusiastically learning American Sign Language with their teacher. A boy approached Leo's wheelchair and, using signs, asked his name. Leo, without hesitation, answered with his voice and with the signs Helena had taught him. He was immediately welcomed into the group, his wheelchair not an obstacle, but just another characteristic in a sea of diversity. Henry and Helena watched from a distance, holding hands, their eyes misty. The scene was the materialization of all their struggles and hopes. The emotional resolution was there, in that noisy, colorful schoolyard, where a boy who had been silenced by cruelty was now finding dozens of new ways to communicate. The greatest return on his investment was right there, in Leo's smile, free and unreserved. The following weeks unfolded like the pages of a long-awaited book. Leo's transition to the new school was smoother than Henry or Helena could have ever imagined. The school community welcomed him with a naturalness that healed the wounds left by the former institution. The children, accustomed to diversity, didn't see his wheelchair as a barrier, but as part of who he was. Leo made friends, began participating in art classes, and discovered an unexpected talent for painting, mixing vibrant colors on canvases that expressed his rediscovered joy. The project, sponsored by Henry, now under Helena's careful management, flourished in the local park. The inclusive drum circles became a meeting point, drawing children from all over the city. The youth drumming troupe got new instruments, and the sound of their beats became the soundtrack of the community's transformation. The hard-won romance between Henry and Helena settled without fanfare. Built on the small gestures of everyday life, one late afternoon, as they watched Leo laugh on an adaptive swing in the park, Henry turned to her. The armor of the multimillionaire was gone, replaced by the vulnerability of a man in love. He kissed her, a gentle kiss, full of silent promises. It was Leo who broke the moment with a knowing smile. "Now I can say," he said, his voice clear and playful, "that I want you both around." The laughter they shared sealed the formation of their new family. The main conflicts found their realistic resolutions. Leo's old school, after the fallout from the case, was forced to implement a rigorous anti-bullying program, with headmistress Monica being invited to take an early retirement at the end of the semester. Patricia, without the stage her gossip provided, faded from their lives, seeking new dramas in other social circles. In the business world, Henry suffered some losses. A few investors, loyal to the old playbook of profit at any cost, pulled away. But others, inspired by his courage, came forward, bringing a new kind of capital. an investment that sought not only financial returns, but also social impact. His empire didn't crumble, it transformed, acquiring a purpose that went beyond charts and stock prices. The greatest transformation, however, was internal. Henry learned to be a father, to find joy in presence, not presence. Helena learned to be a partner, to accept care and express her own needs without fear. And Leo, the boy who had been silenced, found his voice in countless ways, speaking, painting, drumming. He learned that his vulnerability was not a weakness, but a source of strength. One night, while sorting through some old papers, Henry found the report from one of the first doctors he had consulted, a renowned specialist who had diagnosed Leo with selective mutism with an uncertain prognosis. He smiled, crumpled the paper, and tossed it in the trash. The diagnosis was wrong. Leo's silence had not been a sentence. It had just been a wait, waiting for someone who knew how to listen without words. A year had passed since the chilly morning that changed the fate of 3 lives. The sun of a mild autumn bathed the neighborhood park, turning the concrete and grass into a golden stage. The inclusive arts and sports project, sponsored by Henry, was in full swing. That Saturday, the beat of djembes vibrated in the air, the sound of the drum circle mixing with the laughter of children. Some in wheelchairs, others on their feet, all united by the rhythm. Henry watched the scene, no longer in a suit and expensive watch, but in a t-shirt, sunglasses hiding the emotion in his eyes. His business had been restructured. He had channeled a significant portion of his capital and cash flow into social impact investments, finding a new satisfaction that far surpassed the adrenaline of the stock market. His fortune was still vast, but it was now used with a sense of justice and altruism that defined him far more profoundly than his assets or the profitability of his portfolio. He was still a multimillionaire, but now he was also a man of the community. Helena walked over to him, offering a mug of brewed coffee, the familiar, comforting smell. She had enrolled in a social pedagogy course and had turned her experience into a mission, helping other families navigate the labyrinth of inclusion. Her childhood scar, the need to efface herself, had transformed into a source of resilience and human connection. Together, they watched Leo, who was in the center of the circle. The boy was not just clapping to the rhythm, but also using his hands, teaching the alphabet in ASL to a younger classmate. The muteness that had imprisoned him was gone. His voice, now, was the sound of courage. There were no instant miracles. There were still odd looks from strangers, school bureaucracies, and the inevitable pain of growing up. But the family they had chosen, the man from the penthouse, the woman from the brownstone, and the boy who spoke with his eyes, had learned to face the world side by side. Henry's transformation was complete. Instead of apologizing for Leo's situation, he spoke openly about bullying, turning pain into awareness. He no longer tried to control the world. He tried to understand it. It was Leo who provided the final denouement. At the end of the afternoon, as the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, he sat between Henry and Helena, the blue notebook open on his lap. He wasn't drawing or writing. He just looked at them both and, with a breathtaking smile, said a sentence that summed up the entire journey. A person's voice doesn't disappear. It just waits for someone who knows how to listen. The words were a conclusion, a lesson learned by all. Love, they discovered, was an act of justice, a form of altruism that demanded shedding one's pride and fear. New York City, once a backdrop of concrete and haste that separated them, had become the stage for a love that, in the style of a real-life epic, taught them that when a voice finds courage and support, it becomes a song that resonates far louder than any capital. They had won, not against the market, not against society, but against the fear of being themselves, and that was the greatest inheritance of all.